You know, there's all sorts of things that we go through in life. And in the process, we have this whole deal of making decisions, constantly making decisions. Sometimes we do well at it, but often we don't. The reality is that a lot of the problems we face in society are there because of some of the decisions that we've made that are not good. We want to talk about this morning about processing things when it's hard. I want to talk about processing things when it's hard. And we subtitled, we tend to hit panic buttons too easily. What can we put in place to deal with things well? There's a story. It comes from the Bible. It's the most unusual little story in one sense. I've lost my glasses. I kind of need them. Thank you. Oh, no wonder I lost them. Somebody else has managed to get them. It's the most unusual little story. It comes from the book of Mark. It's an unusual story because we don't always think of it in the way that it's told. And I want to read it out to you, and then we're going to unpackage it. That day, when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side of the lake." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. So they're in trouble here. And Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion, showing absolutely no concern here. And the disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Their immediate response for guys who were fishermen, guys who were used to traveling on the water, was to actually react in fear. They didn't think about the kinds of things that they could do. They just went to Jesus, who was calmly asleep in the middle of the storm in the boat, and said, "Don't you care? Don't you care?" And it wasn't, as it turned out in the story, that he didn't care, but it's the fact of the matter that these guys were in a panic state, and they needed to be taught a lesson. They needed to understand what was actually happening here. You see, what they were doing is that they were reacting. And most of us, when we face difficult decisions, whatever they might be, whether it's to turn around in a storm, and sometimes the storms of life are pretty powerful things. You know what it's like when you're having an argument in your marriage? How many haven't had arguments? Liars. Now, how many people are liars here? See, the reality is, you've got to make tough decisions sometimes. And sometimes the hardest decisions are ones that seem so obvious. And when we look at them afterwards, we think, why didn't I do that? Why didn't I react differently? Why didn't I make a different decision? Instead, we go crazy. You see, the truth of the matter is, most people live reactionary lives. We do exactly what the guys that were traveling with Jesus did. We actually imagine the worst. You see, they thought the boat was going to sink. They were convinced everything was going wrong. Now I'm going to borrow one of our strong young men. Who's a strong young man who'd think he's really strong? You'll have to be pretty strong on this one. You can be not young, but you can be older. So somebody I know well won't beat me up afterwards. And here comes. Oh, here we go. Give him a hand. Come on, give him a hand. He's pretending he's going out the back door. Now it's too late. We've given him a hand. I want to suggest a lot of decisions we make are a bit like this clamp. And Moses has come to give me a hand with this clamp, because what I'm going to do he's not screaming yet. How tight is that? Is that about right? Is that right? A bit more? That'll do. Now, when we make hard decisions, this is exactly what it's like in our life. We end up being bound up, Our decision-making muscles are bound up. We can't do the same things we did. Actually, right now it'd be great fun. I could give him a good whack and run, and he'd have trouble following me. That's what it's like. He's looking at me as if to say, I can catch you, but there's no way, man. There's no way. Shall I prove it? You got some supporters. You see, sometimes I have really tough decisions to make. They do this to us. They paralyze us. They lock us up in our thinking muscles. They lock us up inside. And we just don't know how to cope sometimes. We don't know how to respond. Some of the things that have happened to us in our past, like in our family situations, in our work environment, whatever it happens to be, have predisposed us to go and do the wrong things even. Now, what do you do if you're raised, every time you do something slightly wrong, you're told, "You idiot, you're useless"? What happens at that point? The screws go up. And every time he goes to make a decision to move his arm, his muscle inside himself, it's harder. And every time something else goes wrong, another bad decision, the screws go up. I wonder how long I can keep doing this before he screams. But you can see what happens. It actually paralyzes us from making really good decisions. And today, what I'm hoping, but as an end result of this whole thing with you, and I'm expecting, is that what we're going to do, much to Moses' relief, we're going to take the pressure off. And hopefully, we'll bring some major relief. Look at his arm. Let's give him a big hand. He was a courageous man. He's shaking his hand as he goes up. I might have done it up a bit too tight. I wonder what Osh will say. Never mind. You see, the truth of the matter is that what actually happens, because of all that tightening in our lives, we actually panic. Now, some of you will say to me, I don't panic. I want to say you actually do. Often, we perceive panic as to be somebody like on television. You remember Dad's Army? Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic. We perceive that to be panic. But in reality, that's actually not always the expression of panic. You see, panic can cause us to just shut right down, like the guy on the sofa here today. He couldn't function, couldn't operate very well. Things had taken over and he's having trouble making decisions. And so his way of coping was to sleep, to shut down. That's a panic reaction. This whole thing of panic is interesting because I'm sure most of us, if we understood where it comes from, wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. You see, panic, the old panic button, comes from a word that has to do with an old Greek supposed god called Pan. And it was said by the Greeks that this god was said to have the ability to cause extreme irrational fear, especially in lonely or open spaces. That's where the word panic comes from originally. Extreme or irrational fear. And a lot of things we do are irrational. How many of us love another person? We get in an argument with them, and then we go and do something really dumb. And we didn't really want to do it, but we do it. It's an indicator of the kind of things that we fall for. See, panic is a sudden fear which dominates or replaces thinking and often affects either groups or individuals. Now, fear, in terms of this whole thing of panic, you say to me, well, I don't get fearful. No, you probably don't get fearful in the way that you understand fear. But when we find it hard to make decisions and we cannot clearly see the way, it leaves us feeling deeply unsettled within. It sometimes can leave us with all sorts of other emotions that we don't always understand. So I want us to look at what fear really is. See, I found this little acrostic that somebody else had created, and I think it's a really good little acrostic. Fear goes in this little acrostic, so each letter starts a word. Fantasy, expectations, appearing real. The fantasy expectations are things that are not real, but they appear to be really real for me. If I do this, then this will happen. And so we don't make the decision. And I've seen people who for years and years and years have put off making good, healthy decisions. Because if I do this, this might happen. So they don't make good decisions. Whether it be leaders or whether it be any one of us in this place here, that happens to us at times. You know, one of the difficulties I've had as a pastor, and just to share with you some of the type of issues that sometimes we face. Sometimes I end up with people who are going through extreme situations. And on occasion, I've allowed the fear of actually trying to address that person in case there's a reaction to stop me. And I've had to make conscious decision in the recent years to recognize that and not allow that to ever happen again. I've got to make sure it just doesn't happen. So all of us will face these things. And difficulty in the middle of this is that fear takes unsupported premises about impending doom, in other words, we're worried about what might happen, and it amplifies them and presents the alleged results as the inevitable future. So we think, if I do this, then this is what will happen. Well, if I do this, then this is what will happen. If I do this, and none of the options are ones that we want. That's the interesting thing, is that we don't tend to come up with options of opportunity. We tend to come up with options of doom, of failure, the things we fear most. So, let's have a look at it. We have 3 buttons that I've put up there: confusion, fear, and pain. They all belong to the same bracket. And there's some key things I want to say before we start looking at how we can solve this thing. The truth of the matter is that you can give into it, you can struggle with it, accept it, or work around it. They're the choices that you have. You can either give into it, you can cave into it, you can struggle with it, or work around it. They're the choices that you have. And I want to say, first and foremost, understand that you always have a choice about how to respond and to deal with situations. It is not predetermined. There's a thing in our society, is I get what I deserve. Well, sometimes we deserve to get what we get. We deserve to get what happens. But all too often, the reason those things happen is because we precipitated with bad decisions. For example, a young couple going out. Should they go out on their own? Not an easy answer to that question, because it might be different with different people. But I say to some young couples, I think if you're going to go out together as a couple, you need to stay with a group at all times. Because I know that the decisions that you make are defaulting because of your family heritage or other issues that you're facing in your life, is likely to be that if you end up just on your own somewhere, you're going to end up doing things you're going to regret. You're going to make decisions that are not good. So you need to make a decision early in the piece not to cross that line. And the way of doing it is to stay safe, stay in a group. It's a wise piece of advice. What about other issues? Family decisions. If a husband and wife are in disagreement and they can't make a decision, what are they best to do at that point? Well, there's a process that they can go through. So all of us need to be aware of the fact that we need to look at these things. And we need to be aware of the fact that one of the reactions that we have to finding decisions hard to make is that we actually sometimes just simply paralyze ourselves. So we just stop. We just stop and we don't make the decision. And therefore, it's hopeless. I remember when I was younger, for example, and some of you will be very aware of this right now, in the middle of exams. One of the things that used to happen with me, I wasn't very good at studying through the year when I was young and at school. And exam time would come up, and I'd be coming up, and I thought, man, I better look at my books. So I'd pull my books out, and then I would freeze because I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to process the whole thing. I didn't know how to make the decisions. Now, I found out later on that all the professional classes in the school were actually taught how to study. We were in the composite classes, you know. We used to be called the dummies. I'd had a rough education. My parents had moved house so often that it wasn't until after I became a Christian that my education went soaring through the roof. But I was in trouble. I've always felt that it's very unfair that certain people should be taught certain things and other people not. And that was the way school happened in those days. But I used to sit in front of those study books and literally get paralyzed because I couldn't make a healthy decision about how I should go about it. I didn't know how. And I really needed to go to somebody and say, help. But I didn't even know how to do that. Because in my family, you asked for help, you got told you were a sissy or a wuss or something else I won't repeat. You know? So you've got to realize that in terms of this whole deal, that most of us have a default towards not doing well in hard decision making. Some of us will process some things really well, but not others. So I want to start off with this. And I want to start off with a thing on hope for the future, because I think I want you to go out of this door knowing I'm going to make some great decisions. Don't you think it's a good idea? Yeah. Our response to difficult things or situations will determine who we are in the future. Our response now will determine who we are in the future. Now that might seem really obvious, but I want to put it really clearly. There are some people in this world, in New Zealand and overseas, anywhere in the world, who failed at a younger age. Failed at school, didn't do well, left school early, or failed in other areas of their life. But they've made responses later on in life that have meant that they've been able to respond so differently that they've achieved at an incredibly high level. So in the light of what I said before, I don't want to leave you with a hopeless feeling saying, oh, my default settings from my family and my heritage, my past, have left me in trouble. No, our responses today, not yesterday, our responses today to difficult situations, difficult things, will determine who we are in the future. So because you've screwed up in the past, doesn't mean to say you're going to screw up in the future. And that's great news, I reckon. Or it's awesome news. It happened for me, and so I can say it with some surety. So let's look at making good decisions. I've got this little acrostic, another one. I've made this one myself, and it's I'm calling it SAP. And the reason I'm calling it SAP, because it happens to work with my thing, but I had to find letters that made this thing work. SAP is what you find in a tree or a plant. It gives it nourishment and food. So this is what it is, the background of it. The first thing is, I want you to think about stopping. Pressure is often the source of bad decisions. So don't allow yourself to be rushed. When you're trying to make a decision, don't, I've got to make a decision. If it's like that, I would suggest that that's not going to ever be a good decision. You need to stop. For some of us, we need to take time out. And even if the boss is saying, I want to know now, I think you need to have enough self-strength in yourself to say, right now, I need to stop and I need to think. And if you could respect me enough to give me time to process this properly, then that would be most helpful. And if your boss or whoever it is you're working with isn't prepared to give you that time, I'd seriously consider, if I was you, going somewhere else and working somewhere else or whatever. Because you need to be able to have the facility and the ability to stop. And if other people are controlling your lives to such a degree that you can't, then I would suggest that that's a dangerous place for you to be. Because it'll just perpetuate bad decisions. And you're likely to end up losing your job in any case. Pressure is often the source of bad decisions, so don't allow pressure to continue to exist. Now, I know it gets really difficult when your love of your life, she or he is wonderful, and then they are walking away from you. I know what that felt like. That happened to me twice. And so I know some of you it's happened to heaps of times, and I'm not going to try and give an explanation as to why you had that much trouble. I had it happen twice. One girl went out with for a long time. The other girl, we were talking engagement and marriage. I turned up into the second girl and turned up in Nelson, and here she was. And I went to the house, knocked on the door, and my friend Wayne, whose house is going to help paint, his parents' house. I don't know why it's going to help paint, because my father would have told you that I'm about the worst painter. He used to go mad at me when he saw my paint. It got so thin. I wasn't just no good at doing that. And in any case, I knocked on the door, and somebody yelled out, "Come in." So I walked in to find my girlfriend sitting with one of my best mates, snuggled up to him, hand in hand. Man, I made some stupid decisions right then and there. Now, fortunately, I got a bit rescued because I really wanted what God wanted, and I really struggled with that, but I was pretty upset. I coped with it all right on the face of it, and I don't think they even realized how traumatized I was. But I left that, and I went back to my friend's house where I was staying, and I said, stick this. I had enough of this. Actually, it was a bit stronger words than that, but I won't repeat what I said to myself. And I was pretty angry. And so I thought my escape in those days was to sit down, and I still do that sometimes today, and just read. So I picked up book after book after book out of this library. Now, Reader's Digests, I picked them up. Every one I picked up, and I'd look in the thing, for one of the short stories, the trauma stories that they had in the Reader's Digest for years. They don't have so many nowadays. They used to have lots of them in the old days. And I'd read them, and every book I picked up, I could jump years, because they had rows of these Reader's Digests there. And I'd pick one out, and I'd look for the trauma story, and I'd read it, and every one of them had an ending where God got involved. Now, the Reader's Digest, some of them have that, and some of them don't, but every book I happened to choose, and I'd look up this trauma story, read the story, right near the end, God was there, helping people with decisions. I got mad with God. How dare he do that to me? So then I thought, well, I'll fix this. I chose a book I knew was safe. How to Become a Millionaire. I read the whole book. In the last paragraph, in the last two sentences, he said, just by the way sort of thing, I can't remember that wording, but it was kind of a comment that went sort of like, by the way, these principles don't really work to their maximum unless you have a relationship with God. Oh, man, that just isn't fair. He stormtrooped me. He's invaded. I went through our whole book thinking I was safe. I was okay. And right at the end of the book, that's what happens. It's kind of impacted me. Unfortunately for me at the time, I sat there and said, okay, God, I give up. It was the hardest thing to let Louise go. It was really the hardest thing. But I want to say to you today that was the best decision I ever made. She came back to me a few months later and wanted to reestablish a relationship because my mate was just interested in a fling over Christmas. And I loved her with a passion. I still have some love for her. Some people got a bit shocked and thought I was being rude to my wife by saying that, but I'm not. I think if we claim to be followers of God, and some of us here are, and we can't continue loving the people we first loved, then we're fools. We're stupid. We must be thick to love a person that's that unlovable. It's more a reflection of ourselves. And I still love her, but not in the way that I love Pauline, because Pauline was faithful, and the decisions that we made together have proven to be powerful and great. And I ended up with a far better deal by sticking with my instinct and what I believed God wanted me to do. I ended up with a woman who, as I said last week, is prettier than all the other girls now. They've gotten old and they look old. Pauline still looks young to me. I don't care what you think. All right? she's my love. A good decision will always last with you. The second thing I do is after I stop, and I don't always stop that easily, by the way. I have to pull the brake handle on a bit harder sometimes. The second thing I do is I ask this question. Some of you know that this is my favorite question. I ask this question: in God's vast eternal plan, does this thing really matter? Does this situation really matter? In actual fact, it puts everything in perspective, because in God's vast eternal plan, my little issue here, it just, so small, so unimportant. And that, when I ask that question, I can actually relax. Because I don't have to be troubled by what seems so significant to me when I put it in perspective. I don't know whether any of you have been into Carly, the underwater thing. Carly Talton's. It's all right, I got the name totally wrong. You know who I'm talking about. It's an amazing experience. You're under there and there's these huge sharks and other big dangerous looking fish, stingrays and manta rays and all the rest of it. And I know of people who cannot stand in there because they're scared the fish are going to get them. But nobody's been eaten by any of those fish through the glass yet. Not that I know of. Otherwise, I might not have gone down there. And that's kind of what it's like for a lot of us. We get a wrong perspective. We see the size of the giant there, and that becomes the issue rather than the reality. The reality is I'm safe. I'm protected by that glass. And that's a perspective we need to get, because in God's vast eternal plan, that's the kind of way He works. The giants are still there, the things are still there, but He's willing to be like a cover around us and to protect us, each one of us. The third point of the SAP is the process, and I want to spend a bit of time on the process. How should I respond is the question that we need to ask. How should I respond? Now, most of us don't stop to ask, how should I respond? We just go, oh no, I've lost my girlfriend, oh no, this is hurting too much. Oh no, I need to do something. We react. We don't stop, we don't ask, and we don't process. But we need some sap in our lives. Isn't that true? So how should I respond? Well, the first thing I'd like to suggest for you, and I find this very helpful, grapple with the problem. The first thing to do in grappling with the problem is write it down. I often find when I write the problem down that I'm facing that it changes somehow. It doesn't look quite the same as it did when it was just sitting in my head. When I start to write it down, it shifts the perspective somehow. Then when I write down what caused my situation. What actually caused it? And if you're not sure what caused it, make a guess. Like, for example, if your girlfriend's just left you and you haven't had a shower for 5 days, there might be a good reason if you regularly do that. You know? What caused your situation? The second thing I think you should write down, how you felt, both physically and emotionally. Write it down. Write it down. The third thing I would suggest you write down is how you acted in response. When you write it down, you know, one of the things I find, if I write those kinds of things down, I feel real silly about my reaction sometimes. And it does help. Why did I do this thing? And the fourth one, what you can do to cope or feel better. What can I do to cope or feel better? So in terms of that, if you're going to write it down, I'd like to look now at 5 headings of healthy processing. First thing, in terms of the writing down, you need to define the problem. A problem is simply the difference between what you think you want and what you have. It's between what you think you want and what you have. A problem is simply a difference between what you are facing and what is possible. So it's good to define it. Write it down. What may look like a poor alternative at first may later show itself to be the best choice. And some of you won't appreciate me saying this, but when I first met Pauline, she was little, she was petite, she was on fire in the group, but she wasn't as pretty as the other two girls that gone out, in my eyes. In my eyes. But like I said before, she's little, petite, and pretty now. I went and visited one of my old girlfriends 4 years ago, her and her husband, and I hadn't seen her for many years, and I didn't recognize her. She'd changed so much. It was so hard to think, wow. I can look at Pauline when I wake up in the morning, and I like to wake up in the morning and look at her and think, boy, what a good decision I made. You know? What a good decision I made. But it wasn't just because of me. It was something that God was doing in my life, and it's explained in that way in quite strong terms. The second thing I want to look at is the whole thing of actually turning your problems into opportunities. We find numerous occasions in the Bible with situations. We find Paul, for example, in the Bible over and over again. People were trying to get him, people were trying to persecute him, people were trying to kill him, and every time he managed to turn it around. Even when he got chucked into prison. You know what he did in prison? Paul and Silas, two guys, they got chucked into prison simply because they were Christians. They were sitting in the prison there singing, we're told in the scripture, when this huge earthquake happened. And the chains fell out of the walls fell to pieces. And all the other prisoners came free as well. And the jailer came out and looked at the mess, and he knew he was about to, because if you're a jailer and you let the prisoners escape, you know what happened? You got paid for it. Whoosh, chopped off. Finish of your life. You weren't allowed to let the prisoners go. That was finish of your life. If you let the murderers and that go. And Paul yells out to the jailer, hey, don't do that to yourself. We're all still here. It's quite an amazing story, really. Because he could have run away. The walls are broken, pretty seriously. We're still all here, he says. The jailer comes in, and the jailer says, oh, what must I do? Because he'd heard Paul and Silas singing. He knew that they believed in God. He knew that their faith had caused them to yell, hey, don't kill yourself. He knew that Paul was concerned about him and his family and their lives. Paul and Silas turned a really difficult, sad situation into a very, very positive experience for not only themselves, because they got an apology in the end, not only themselves, but also for the jailer and his whole family. And can you imagine if you were some of the other prisoners in that prison that day? I can tell you, it would have changed your life. So a most difficult situation can be changed. So you're turning a problem into an opportunity. So they thought they'd sing to the Lord, and they'd sing out loud. They wouldn't do a wee quiet thing. They were amongst a bunch of big tough prisoners. A whole lot of them had done all sorts of things, and they decide to sing. Wow, that's a bit of a turnaround, isn't it? When you think of problems, you'll only attract more problems. Can I really spell this out? If you focus on your problem, if you focus only on the problem, you know what you'll do? You'll end up perpetuating it. I have seen so many young adults, for example, who have focused on the fact that they struggle with certain issues in their lives. The consequences, they keep thinking about it so much that they end up doing the dumb things that they thought about because they started believing it. Whereas the whole thing is, when you think of your problems, you only attract problems. You'll only create bigger issues. And I can tell you now, if you focus on your problems all the time, that's what you're going to do. There's an old saying, there are no problems, only opportunities if you have the right attitude. There are no problems, only opportunities. So I'd like to suggest that you change how you see your problems. Instead of seeing your problem as a problem, see it as an opportunity that God has maybe given you. If you're not a follower of God yet, I want to tell you now that He chucks all sorts of stuff in our way. And if we're gonna see the whole thing clearly, we have opportunities that abound in our lives. Huge numbers of them. We just don't see them often because we're too focused on the problems. What if you have a staffing issue at work, or you have you have an issue in the school? What if something is pervading you? You know, one of the biggest things that happens with young adults is when they get afraid of other people, they show that fear, and the people smell it, and they get even more aggressive, and so there's even more fear. I remember after I got my head bashed in a few years ago, the Wu-Tang gang guys, I wasn't meant to live. It's a miracle I'm standing here today, literally. A short time afterwards, several weeks afterwards, I was finally able to walk around on my own. And I was able to start driving, because I wasn't allowed to drive for quite a while because I couldn't walk on my own. I'd fall over because I just had no balances. And I went down to the local shops here, and I parked the car, and I went to the post box to get my the post box down at the shops down there. And as I was getting out of my car, I suddenly realized the whole Wu-Tang gang, all the younger ones there and a couple of the older ones, but some of them were already in prison because of what had happened. And I had to make a decision then. It was a really hard decision. Do I go to my post box or wait until they're gone? But I knew within myself that if I didn't go to the post box right then and there, I would never go to the post box while they were there, because that fear would control me. And I knew the fear was trying to, because, I can tell you, my gut got tuned up, my heart started racing, I didn't feel great. But I got out of the car, all right, so I walked across, and I walked between the group, and that was hard, because I had to walk literally through them. And I was getting halfway through when one of the young guys, and I could have known, I should have known this was going to happen, one of the young guys says, "Oh, our guys beat you up, hey, ha, ha, ha." At that moment, my fear totally disappeared, because this was an opportunity, and I saw it for what it was. It was an unusual opportunity, but it was there. And I said, yeah, but they wouldn't have had the guts to stand there and not retaliate and get their heads beaten in, would they? And there was this, and then one of the girls, she's a bit older, I think she's probably 15 or 16 years old. She said, because the older gang members some of them were in prison and they weren't there on this occasion. She said to the boy, "Yeah, you guys are just chickens," something or other. I won't repeat the word she said. And then one of the other guys says, "Yeah," like that, I didn't quite knew what he meant by yeah. In case one of them comes over and he says, "Hey man, hey," and he put his hand out. So I shook his hand. I end up standing in that group and I end up telling them about my faith in Jesus Christ and how it enables me to be able to walk with God and to make decisions that are good, because decisions that are bad lead you into gangs and things like that. I come out of there and back in my car, whoa, I can go anywhere. You see, it doesn't just happen, and I want you to understand, it doesn't happen easily for even those people that are considered to be sort of men of faith. Like some of you label pastors as. Some of the pastors are more wussy than some of you. No, seriously. They are. You can tell when you give them a handshake. You get a fish in your hand. And they need to learn it as much. We all need to learn it. I had to learn it. You have to learn it. They have to learn it. Every one of us has to learn it. But the truth of the matter is, there are opportunities there that we don't always see because we're so focused, like the disciples, on the storm and not focused on the opportunity. And whereas Jesus was focused on the opportunity, not on the storm. He was focused on the opportunity to say to the guys, "Hey man, hey guys, you really do have power available to you with me." And they learned that pretty quickly. The next one I want to touch on, health in terms of healthy processing. Solution thinking. Don't focus on the problem, look for solutions. This is a slightly different twist on what I said before. Look for solutions. It is important to the decision-making process that a good number of alternatives be sought out so the best decision can be made. Don't just assume there's this decision and nothing else, or that decision or this decision. There often are multiple choices in front of you. You just don't see them. In the Bible, we have some very famous stories, and Sometimes the decisions that people made, like Moses, when God told him, when the people were grumbling and he had to make a decision, and God told him, you go up and you speak to the rock and water will flow out enough for a couple of million people. And the people were grumbling and they got Moses all agitated and angry. He didn't like taking responsibility for a couple of million people. In any case, they're a bunch of idiots. And so he gets his rod that he had in his hand that he'd already done some miracles with, His rod had already been showing some miracles. He gets the rod and he gets angry. And he whacks the rock. He whacks it. And water still comes out. But he made a bad decision because he's told that's not the way to do it. He was told that he just had to speak the rock. He didn't, God wasn't happy with him whacking the rock. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we whack people. And God told us not to. And I'm not talking about necessarily hitting them, but sometimes verbally we do it. And God morally says, don't do that kind of thing. You need to show respect and love and appreciation, all those kinds of things. So we need to think about that. Expect that there is an innovative, practical solution just waiting to be found. Expect it because God has told us that He will go before us and He'll help us in every situation. And if we're hitting a problem, He's promised to help us if we allow Him to do that. You see, the truth of the matter is, God helps me through difficult situations by talking to me through His written words and communication. He's got it written down, and I want to touch on a couple of aspects of that. You see, we say, well, how do I know what it says? How do I know what it says to me? Well, there's two aspects to this whole thing of getting it right and understanding how we can make good decisions. The first thing is, we can ask the question, what is God's will for me? I'm facing this awful situation. Is God allowing me to get beaten up? Am I meant to live like this? Am I destined to suffer? All those kind of questions we have. Why does this happen to me? Always. I used to feel that when I was younger. Why? Well, there are two aspects to it. Two answers to it. Two aspects of one answer, really. There's God's moral will. It's the first one. It's not a quick fix. It's not a quick fix recipe in any sense of the word. What actually happens with the Bible is what's called context. Location, location, location. Same kind of thing in the Bible. People go to it and they say, I can get guidance to solve my hard problem. And God, show me. And how guys do a drama where they did this and opened the Bible and they read it and it says, Judas hung himself. Okay, God, show me the next word you want. And they do this and it says, stab the finger and read under the words and it says, go thou do likewise. God's not into that kind of deal. In fact, can I suggest if that's the way you get guidance, you are very messed up. Very, very messed up. Don't tell me otherwise. You can argue with me all you like, but one day you're going to stand in front of God and God's going to tell you you're messed up because you didn't listen to what He said. Because the Bible's not meant to be some magic charm quick fix. There's a moral law in there. And if you understand the whole picture, you will know how to make a lot of decisions. For example, the moral law says, don't have sex before marriage. That's easy. It's not so easy to hold to, but it's easy. It's there. There's a whole bunch of things that are there in terms of God's moral law. And there's some very clear principles about the way we should live. For example, one of the things God's moral law says, we need to be part of His body, part of His people. And we need to be functioning using the gifts He wired us up for. Because then we will know life, and we'll know life till its fullest, He says to us, really clearly. It's part of His moral law. That He's designed us to fit together in a particular way. And it's not about what we want, it's about what He knows is best for us, what He's designed us for. I want to tell you, some of you are crude as. Really crude. I know. One day I was here and I was working with some of the guys and we had to get a little piece of concrete. And one of the guys goes and he gets one of our good screwdrivers. He gets a big hammer and he goes, whack! You know what happened? The plastic handle split apart. It says, don't whack screwdrivers. Chisels are designed for that. Screwdrivers are not. We do the same thing in life all too often. There's God's moral law. Most hard decisions of life can be answered clearly with God's moral teachings in the Bible. But you can't do it unless you know it. The second aspect, and the last aspect I want to touch on, is God's will for you personally. This is far more difficult, because what He says to you won't be what He says to me. I went through this incredible struggle when I became a Christian through a guy who was leading a mission agency group. And so the only focus I could see, I was going to be a missionary. I was all prepared to go on the mission field with the Anglican Church, a CMS. And I was due to go and replace a guy who had been working there for a number of years. He needed a year's furlough, and so I was going to go and run in a training centre. Right at that point, I went through a theological dilemma. The liturgy, the written prayers, the Anglican Church, some people really appreciate it, but for me, the whole thing fell apart, and I thought I lost my faith. My Anglican vicar told me I was Baptistic, and that scared the wits out of me, because they're weird people as far as I was concerned. Somebody had told me somewhere, I can't remember who, but bad decision listening to other people's say-sos. So I decided, through some other things that God did, I ended up in the Baptist church. And that meant I couldn't go with this mission, because this mission in those days would only allow Anglicans. Now they've shifted since. They do allow other fellas and ladies to go on their mission. But in those days they didn't. And so it meant I wasn't able to go. And then we trained, Pauline and I trained in a missionary training college, and expecting to get visas to go to Kalimantan, and then Kalimantan, Borneo Island in Indonesia, and then we couldn't get visas for there. One of the hardest things for me was to accept that, and to accept that maybe God wanted to do something different in my life. And being a pastor certainly wasn't even considered. I didn't see myself that way. See, every one of us is different. God's individual will for you is the hardest to decipher, as the only way to understand it is to be in relationship with Him. God doesn't always take us down the easiest or the most obvious route. He wants us to be in such a close relationship with Him that we're like the child that holds our daddy's hand and says, "Dad, where do you want to go?" Allow Dad to lead them. Jesus actually even said we need to learn to be like children in terms of faith. So I want to finish with this last slide here. I would love for every one of you to know that your life is a great adventure of great decisions, but I know some of them are not going to be that great. But from today on, I'd encourage you to stop. What was the second one? Ask. In God's vast eternal plan, does this thing really matter? And then the last one, P, process. Process the thing carefully. Take your time doing it. And I'd suggest you process it with God. And if you don't know Him yet, God's not offended if you want to start talking to Him. He'd love you to do that. That's what He's all about. And so we're going to do that right now. And I'd like you to join me if you'd like to do so. Father God, we come to you right now. And we'd ask that your power and your love might be evident in everything that we do. That we might understand what it is to know you in such a way that we can make decisions that are great. That we can have lives that are really full and exciting because of those decisions, which is a promise that you've given. God, we want to say sorry because we've often made decisions which have been an offense to you. We've often done things that are wrong. We've often chosen to even sin, and that's been a decision that's not been good. And this morning, we'd like to say sorry to you, and we'd like to be able to pick up the things that you'd like us to do from now on, to be able to understand the direction and the great things you aspire for us. Lord, help us to aspire to those things, to be able to pursue those things. And we'd ask, God, that you might break off the things of the past that have controlled us so much and help us to get help where we need it, to have an adventure that'll be worth the living, and to bless those around us. In Jesus' mighty name. And all the people said? And all the people said? Well, Lord bless you. Hey, let's give the team a great big huge hand again. They did awesome here this morning.